everyone. My name is Yumi Vasquez. I am a member of the EPCC Architecture Society. I'm really honored to start off this first lecture of the semester today, and today I'm here with the members of the EPCC Architecture Society. We have our president, Sabrina King, our vice president, David, and also as our secretary, which is Michelle, and our treasurer, who is Stephanie Juarez, and our historian is Jose Roberto. Of course, we also have our advisors, which are Professors Crystal Lindstrom and Professor Emmanuel Moreno. I hope you all enjoy this lecture. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Arch Talk Presents. I'm Crystal Lindstrom. I'm co-faculty advisor for the Architecture Society, and due to the current events, we've decided that alongside of our lectures, we will be conducting interviews nationally and internationally with architects. And thank you very much for your time. And I would also, again, I'd like to ask you to please mute yourselves as we move on in the interview to avoid feedback in the presentation. And now I'd like to pass it on to Professor Moreno.
All right, thank you, Crystal. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to first thank the students for working so hard over this summer. Believe it or not, they've been at it since early July. Trying to get all the lectures and trying to get all these interviews that Ms. Lindstrom just talked about ready and up on YouTube. I believe we have 3 of those interviews already up there. And as Noemi mentioned earlier, this is going to be recorded. And so once we get it nicely edited and everything, we will be loading that up to YouTube as well. Over the summer as well, I caught up with a former student of mine, Cesar Lopez, who introduced me to a wonderful young lady. And I got to learn quite a bit about her. She is a graduate of the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She had her master's at MIT, and she got to work in Paris, I believe through a grant that was alongside with MIT, and she came back and she's now a part-time instructor or professor at UNM. She told me a wonderful story that she's going to be telling you, so I'm not going to jump in and ruin the plot of everything. So I will now introduce you to Alaa Quarishi.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I will go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. So go ahead and type in questions into the chat as I go into this lecture, and at the end I can sort of jump in and answer any questions I see. Does that sound good to everybody?
Yeah, okay. Definitely. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's get started. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Okay. So the palm tree of Los Angeles is its own entity. It is spelled with a capital P and T. It is inherently contronymic. A contronym is defined as a word with 2 opposite meanings. Although referred to as tree, it biologically is not. It is a monocot, similar to grass. Although it is completely embedded into the making of Los Angeles, it is not native to the city. Different trees from around the world, along with their stories, participate in constructing myths continuously perpetuated by Los Angeles. These myths, too recent to completely shed their history, and yet too ideological to provide a complete picture, tell us how the city was founded, who were the key figures, and what challenges they overcame. These myths tell origin stories. They justify present realities. These myths are the stories European settlers created to instill meaning in Los Angeles. Some of these myths were propagandistic alterations designed for commercial and political gain. Others were earnest attempts to record stories. Without fail, however, the stories involved image more than reality. In our case, the image of the prom. This image is so deeply rooted as an LA icon that it cannot nor should not be fully disentangled. However, the singular narrative surrounding the palm tree as a symbol lacks dimensionality. LA's palm trees are dying, and it's changing the city's famous skyline. Read a headline of the LA Times article published September 22nd, 2017. I think there might be some sound in the background. Here, the death of the palm tree is perceived as a new threat to the city, and its notorious sprawling skyline punctuated by swaying fronds. But has the presence of an entity so vital to the city's image always been portrayed positively? Almost 8 decades earlier, we see that the image of the palm tree hasn't always been beloved. In 1936, the same LA Times published an article about the fading fashion of the palm tree. In 1942, the Times reinforces its judgment of this fading fashion by writing, "The present trend is away from the bizarre and the exotic." Given this stark contrast of how we view LA's palm trees today, how do we collapse the contemporary mythological reference with what has historically been perpetuated or challenged? Throughout the scope of this thesis, I argue that the fear of the palm leaving completely is part of the historical trend of public opinion, undulating between reverence and hatred. In response, this thesis disrupts that wave by bringing multiple stories, both positive and negative, forward in one continual experience, proposing an alternative mythology. The proposal moves from a flat representation to a collapsed one. Flat representation is when the myth references only a single meaning at a singular moment, whereas collapsed representation allows the myth to represent multiple meanings across a span of time. This project is both an exploration and subsequent presentation of the many often neglected myths which contribute to LA's aesthetic construction. By expanding from flat to collapsed representation, we can re-present the origin story of LA and unearth the often neglected narratives of LA's past lingering just beneath its perfectly manicured grounds. This work is in conversation with a series of different architectural typologies. The first typology is the Architectural Manifesto, or Treatise on the City, which uses representation to program a new reading of the urban form. This typology reads the form and image of a specific city through the eyes of a foreigner, but concludes by extrapolating these observations to larger claims about cities in general. The methodology employed here analyzes the history of LA through its palm trees and constructs alternative origin myths. The second typology is that of a series of object-scale interventions explicitly charged with symbolic myths surrounding their sites. By encountering these interventions in everyday context, the perception of those myths associated with these activities gradually transforms over time. Here, small-scale interventions are actively utilized to destabilize dominant histories and disseminate alternative imaginaries. The third typology works in the Persianate literary tradition of the Nameh, a book that tells a type of history through painting and verse, establishing an immediate link to the exotic Oriental that has been key in the perpetuation and circulation of the image of the palm tree. By using the aesthetic of Persian miniatures, the thesis reorientalizes representations of the palm tree. I use the term reorientalize intentionally in an effort to reorient the interpreter. Architecturally, The proposal is imagined as a series of interventions in the city that can be approached either on their own or in a constructive group. The series of interventions are put together as a name. This is the Palm Name, the epic of the palm. This thesis is produced through three things. First, a book, which is a manuscript of the Palm Name, holding drawings of the interventions and the myths that they recall. Second, a map that combines these interventions, stringing together the alternative urban reading of the city. And third, a book stand that acts as a stage for the mythology to be told. This object's ornament acts as an index to the Palm Name. The loop has two directions. From left to right, the intended audience is a local, but from right to left, the audience is a foreigner. So I'll present this loop to you from right to left, in the eyes of a foreigner. We will start with Chapter 1 in MacArthur Park, called Shade. We start with the moral character, who is drawn to Los Angeles. In 1872, Charles Nordhoff writes about how Los Angeles is the ideal subtropical land, domesticated for white people. These are the people, as the myth goes, who established the city. They use the palm tree as a tool to aestheticize this alternative tropic that doesn't have disease or lawlessness, but has security, comfort, and a claim to the newly constructed subtropical climate. But it wasn't the most useful tree to have around. In 1899, Grace Ellery Channing writes about how palms are as useful for shade as the telegraph poles. In 1908, the city changed the greenery in MacArthur Park to subtropical, and in response, the LA Times protested the lack of shade. In MacArthur Park, we add a shading device to alleviate the shortcomings of the palm. This intervention makes the inherent lack of shade apparent. The first palm tree planted in Los Angeles was at the Spanish mission of San Gabriel in Los Angeles around 1771. This tree was imported for its fronds to be used on Palm Sunday. This marks the beginning of a moral and religious association with the palm tree in Los Angeles. In 1874, Benjamin Truman's semi-tropical California first introduced the word semi-tropical into widespread use in the region. In 1872, the Southern Pacific Railroad hired Charles Nordhoff to write on California in order to attract new settlers. He produced California, a book for travelers and settlers, which he praises the virtues of California's tropical form as distinct from other tropics in the world. Written here, he says, California is our own, and it is the first tropical land which our race has thoroughly mastered and made itself at home in. There and there only, on this planet, the traveler and resident may enjoy the delights of the tropics without their penalties. A mild climate, not enervating, but healthful and health-restoring. A wonderfully and variously productive soil, without tropical malaria, the grandest scenery, with the perfect security and comfort in traveling arrangements. Strange customs, but neither lawlessness nor semi-barbarism. He speaks of California as a place of production, of comfort, of leisure, but is wary of mentioning that it is strange in only ways that are lawful. It purports that this land was domesticated by Anglo-Saxons. In that same spirit, Charles Dudley Warner, another East Coast writer, was hired in 1891 by the Santa Fe Railway for $10,000 to take the rail to Los Angeles and write about his surroundings to promote settlements. The literature was produced in order to attract immigrants, not tourists, and therefore describe the economic ease of life in such fertile lands. In 1888, the book Walter Linley and J.P. Whitney wrote, California of the South. It makes an appeal for new settlers and race explicit. The law of improvement of race by selection and elimination, and that of other law of the power climatic surroundings to influence race development. These authors claim that just as the Anglo-Saxon race has improved California, the climate of California has the power to improve the Anglo-Saxon race. California was also seen as the plentiful cornucopia of the world. Railroad companies often employed these advertising campaigns in order to sell their land holdings around their western stops to potential settlers. As part of their advertising, they reinforced the myth of semi-tropical California by paying farms to close the rail lines to plant palms along them. Alternate advertisement was produced, exposing the monopoly of the railroad companies. In 1882, The Curse of California showed the poster shown here to the right, shows the railroad as a monster of destruction. The image of bounty and ease of life earned through hard work was exported during exhibitions such as the Southern California Citrus Fair in Chicago in 1886 and the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. A Canary Island palm tree was exported from California to those exhibitions. These displays of bounty and hard work were aimed at the Protestant white families from the East and the Midwest. MacArthur Park was designed with a subtropical theme, which was immediately protested by residents. And in The Land of Sunshine, Grace Ellery Channing writes about how palms, while as useful as telegraph poles for the purpose, serve as shade trees. We move to Chapter 2, located in Ocean Square in the center of downtown, named Secure. In 1952, Pershing Square in downtown LA was excavated to build an underground parking garage. The Los Angeles Police Department recommended that the new park plant palm trees for ease of surveillance, mainly to intervene on political rallies, drug deals, and quote-unquote gay encounters. We secure the square now with mirrored canopies, giving people directly under the palm tree the agency of surveillance. We move away from exterior control and more to an internalized reflection under this new canopy. Our moral characters have now morphed into law-abiding citizens. In 1913, a headline read, "Los Angeles jail to have palms and ferns." The chief of police said the prisoners could ponder their crimes among palms hanging and baskets of plants arranged in the most fashionable effects. Palm trees here symbolize a sense of morality and idealness that was linked to the law. Prior to excavation, Pershing Square was once a bustling public space filled with lush amounts of greenery located within the heart of downtown, shown here. The excess palm trees removed from the site were sent to Disneyland. Once excavation was complete, LAPD suggested palm trees for ease of surveillance. Transparency in public spaces aims to create exposed citizens who will act morally by knowing that there is an outside institution as well as their peers surveilling the landscape through vistas created between the thin, tall stumps of the palms. We move to Chapter 3, which is located along Freeway 101 during the 1992 riots. In 1926, gardeners cared for the trimmed, neat petticoats left on the trunk of a palm tree, claiming no palm tree should be stripped naked. These petticoats erupted into the balls of flame during the Rodney King riots in 1992, when people set palm trees alight, claiming them to be fake. When power dynamics such as racism are ignored, riots spark in the face of fakeness. In response, the city stripped palm trees of their petticoats in 2006. Here, we recoat the palm tree adjacent to the one burned in 1992, with a fireproof petticoat covering the char caused by the original fire. The length of each simulated frond is associated with the number of fatal encounters with LAPD from 2000 upwards. The simulated fronds reference the aesthetic of nearly manicured palms that have been stripped away in the acts of fireproofing. The act of fireproofing here is only as thick as the coat, and hints at the lack of addressing structural problems relating to power. In 1992, the Rodney King riots broke out after 4 police officers were acquitted of their crimes related to their assaults on Rodney King. Whereas many believed that systematic oppression was no longer present in the early 90s, the riots exposed a racist system to people that don't experience it on a daily basis. In the city of Los Angeles, it isn't only racism that is thinly veiled. It is a city of simulation that surrounds itself with its own fake topic, where palm trees readily produce a certain image of the city. This image was always meant to be curated, where petticoats were neatly trimmed and kept, where naked palm trunk could be seen as in proper care. During the riots, next to the Freeway 101 near downtown, a man was being interviewed about the riots. He held a match in his hand as she spoke. He interrupted her, saying, "Listen, lady, it's not a real tree, it's a fake one. They're all fake. I'm taking this one out. Don't worry, it'll be all right." With one quick flick, he flings the lit match into the palm tree, as seen here. Today, at that same site, we can see the stump of the burnt tree and the charred face of its neighbor that forever lives on in the memory of the events of that day. Chapter 4, along the Walk of Fame on Hollywood Boulevard. Frame. If the myth of Los Angeles began with a hardworking, white, moral, masculine character, it then transforms into the orientalized, feminine, immoral consumer. In 1910, Hollywood didn't want trees of any sort in its newly forming business district, thinking that greenery would be anti-business by evoking a rural aesthetic. However, in Hollywood and elsewhere today, the palm tree became associated with commerce. This, in part, is due to America's sweetheart in the 1940s, Mary Pickford, who recommended palm trees as street trees so that she may window shop from her car. On Hollywood Boulevard, along the Walk of Fame, we remove the palm trees on the street and replace them with framing devices. These devices neatly frame storefronts that were previously flanked by palm trees, but have now been obstructed by the ample canopy of the shade trees. It is for the citizens to decide whether it shall become the center of business life. It is for the citizens to decide whether it shall become a center of business life of a great growing city, or whether it shall become a pretty little suburb of beautiful trees. This has been said about the city of Hollywood. As the city of Hollywood was starting to establish in 1910, the equation for business and success did not include lush greenery, which was often associated with ruralness, everything the city was trying to escape. The rural was pushed outside of the city, as suburbs, and the city itself existed strictly as a place of commerce. As Hollywood became further engulfed by Los Angeles, it also found its true calling in the world of business, making image. And as the city of Hollywood enters that imaginary, with it enters the palm-lined streets of Hollywood. Here is the transformation of the moral character to the immoral character. As greenery is introduced back into the city through palm-lined streets of Hollywood, it carries an Edenic residue with it. The manicured tropical uses the image of an immoral lushness to represent the city itself. The immoral character is born in these streets as those who produce an artificial image of themselves. The character shifts from the hardworking, all business model to the idolization of images produced and consumed by the masses. Mary Pickford becomes the image that is consumed by the masses. As the image of the palm built a sense of identity in the success of Hollywood and was exported in other exchanges as a symbol of success. For instance, in 1953, the first flight from Los Angeles to Boston was symbolically commemorated with a palm tree, gifted to Boston. Headlines read, "Palm gift to Boston marks air tourist run." Chapter 5, located at the UCLA Film and Television Archive, The Race. The immoral character also wants us to pretend that she has been transported to an exotic land where she is free to consume and to indulge in her vices with impunity. In 1936, the film The Garden of Allah came out, telling the story of a monk who broke his monastic vows in the middle of the Arabian desert, indulging his vices. We go to Hollywood Forever Cemetery to screen films in which palm trees are erased, calling to the Orientalized symbol of the palm in film. Here we see the scene of the monk lying in the desert with only silhouettes of the dangling palm trees remaining above. The Cahuilla people in the Palm Springs were initially documented in 1853 by Anglo-Americans. The accounts exoticized the Cahuilla, stating the scene had an Oriental aspect, and the similarity was made still more striking by groups of the Arab-like Indians. In the early 1900s, as automobiles gained popularity, Palm Springs became a tourist destination for health tourists, and the Automobile Club of Southern California told members to go to Palm Springs for a taste of Egypt. In 1921, a bill passes to make Palm Springs a national park, and shortly after, the headlines of the LA Times read, "Palm Canyon, part of Southern California's Little Araby, became a national park." Little Araby was the only part of California with native palm trees, often subject to Orientalist representation. The date festival, this also became home to the United States date farms. Once these farms saturated the region, Indio opened their first Riverside County Fair and National Date Festival in Indio, California in 1921. These festivities, complete with the representation of the Taj Mahal, an Arab market, an Arab princess, pageants, marks the monument when the wearing of costumes transformed an initially Orientalist view of the region into a kitsch version of it. It became a space where ordinary citizens could wear costumes, play Oriental, and indulge their vices. The Coconut Grove in Los Angeles opened its doors in 1921. It was infamously the place where actors and actresses would come to get a drink under some fake palm trees. This environment simulated the mystic of the Arabian desert where an immoral character could indulge. The Garden of Allah Hotel was opened in 1936, where actors and wealthy frequented and were often found naked by the poolside. The hotel took its name from the 1927 film, the poster shown here, which depicts a monk who broke his monastic vows in the exotic Saharan desert underneath the palm trees. Chapter 6, located in Venice Beach, coffee. In 1904, Abbot Kinney designed Venice of America, a failed simulated copy of the city of Venice, where stagnant water canals still exist today. At Venice Beach, we make a simulated copy of the palm trees that have been removed, allowing us to snap a quick Instagrammable picture with our iPhones as we lounge at the beach. We're able to evoke the image of the palm tree even in its absence. To fill the demand of the new market, a new commodity was devised, the rot culture, kitsch, destined for those who, insensible to the values of genuine culture, are hungry nevertheless for the diversion that only culture of some sort can provide. Albuquerque of Los Angeles wanted to tap the market that is described above. In 1904, Kinney designed a development he called Venice of America, complete with canals, boat rides, and palm-lined streets, of course. He simulated the city of Venice as a residential neighborhood. But this simulation tore at the seams as mosquitoes hovered over stagnant waters filling the canals, and people lacked interest in this little world Kinney so carefully created. So, abandoning the canals, he moved to the pier, creating a small Venice as a series of markets along the pier. And, unlike the neighborhood, it didn't ask for a full immersion, but that a version that you can come, consume, and leave. Similar failed simulations continued to happen throughout Los Angeles. In 1915, 1,500 potted palms were placed in a shopping district and met with displeasure. They were completely abandoned because, as the headline says, nobody loves them. In 1972, a 1.7-mile stretch tested plastic trees on Jefferson Boulevard near Loyola Monuments. The idea behind it was to reduce maintenance and care for greenery, producing a similar effect. It became an instant scandal and failure as the plastic degraded more quickly than initially imagined due to the pollution and to vandalism. But there were also success stories. As palm trees grew in popularity, the palm tree brokers would roam the city, buying palm trees from private properties and selling them sometimes at tenfold profit. In 1989, International Treescapes, a company based in California, preserved palm trees shown here for the Mirage Hotel lobby in Las Vegas, which at the time was the world's largest hotel. The image of the palm tree has become so important to Los Angeles' identity that the 1994 art license plate still in circulation today displays an array of palm trees. Jean Baudrillard writes on simulacra and simulation. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. Chapter 7, in Culver City, Roots. In 1917, Culver City was incorporated into LA as an all-white planned community. We come back to the palm-lined streets of Culver City, attaching booths, which are artificial frond sub-extensions, to the 4 most popular palm species used in LA. These booths tell the origin story of each palm, showing a globe with a place of origin at the center of vision. This series of origin stories allow for a globally scaled narrative to be traced. Although the palm tree is seen as a native symbol to LA, the roots of each tree trace back to places around the globe. In 1927, Walter Swingle traveled to Morocco, where he found some date shoots to take back to the United States to test the possibility of date farming. When he was being shown around, he noticed a lot of the trees looked weak, and soon learned that they were infected with bayous. Not wanting to import a disease, he received offshoots from a farm that hadn't been infected yet. They were farming the now famous medjool dates. He brought the dates home and found that they grow successfully in Coachella Valley. Meanwhile, the disease ran rampantly through Morocco, sparing no tree. When this species of date was wiped out in Morocco, the only thing that saved it globally was its exportation to the US. It was then re-exported back to Morocco. This re-exportation muddies with the idea of nativeness, where a tree couldn't exist in its native climate and only exists now because of its removal. Not a single palm tree in Los Angeles is native. The top 10 planted palms in the county and where they are native are as follows: the Mexican fan palm found in northwest Mexico, the queen palm found in southern Brazil, the Canary Islands date palm found in the Canary Islands of Spain, the king palm found in eastern Australia, the California fan palm found in southwest California, the windmill palm found in Central Asia, the pygmy date palm found in southeastern Asia, the Guadalupe palm found on the Guadalupe Islands, the date palm found in North Africa, and the Mediterranean fan palm found on the western Mediterranean. The top 4 are currently lining the streets of Culver City, each street lined with one type. The interventions are placed on these trees. Their origin stories, drawn on simulated boots, are told as a way to not forget the international reach and circulation of these trees. One of the first claims to the image of the palm nativeness in Los Angeles occurred right before the 1932 Olympics. Shown here, in 1931, the city conveniently declared palms as good for infrastructure because they did not buckle sidewalks and did not shed fruit. Immediately after, the city planted 40,000 palm trees in preparation for the Olympics. Post-Olympics, people went crazy over Cantita palms. These easily potted palms can survive indoors. Their popularity ensured that many of Los Angeles' nurseries were filling national orders for Cantillas. Chapter 8, located in the Los Angeles River, Perforate. The concurrent destruction of these myths has constantly simmered below the surface, threatening to dismantle these phony worlds and the characters who built them. Lack of water, funding, and shade each expose the physical pitfalls of the palm tree. In 1888, Mary Austin writes about LA's sickly-looking palm trees in a time of drought. In 2006, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power officially discourages the planting of the palm tree as a municipal street tree. We come to the River of LA, which is currently a sea of concrete with a thin trickle of water flowing over it. This is where all the palm trees removed from our previous sites are transplanted. This project perforates the concrete basin, inserts the palm trees, and allows runoff to water the roots and to recharge the water table below. Mary Austin moved to Los Angeles in 1888. When writing her autobiography, she remarks, "The wreck of the lately busted boom, the jerry-built bungalows, the blameless young palms, abandoned along with the avenues they had been planted to adorn. The unwatered palms had a hurt but courageous look, as of young wives when they first suspect that their marriages may be turning out badly. The unwatered palm is an expose of its own image. It still stands, but it lacks comfort that allows it to hold strong in its roots. As more and more palms show defeat and bow to droughts, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, as of 2006, officially discouraged the planting of palm trees as street trees. The decision seems to mirror the opinion of the city's forester, P.J. Harper, who has been heard saying, 'I'm not a friend of the palm as a street tree.' This thesis makes visible the hidden myths which construct our everyday relationships to urban form, which color the judgments we create about the city's symbols. The interventions in this thesis use objects that directly relate to their context as a link to alternative mythologies surrounding their specific urban and historical sites. It uses a seemingly flat aesthetic to tell a seemingly flat myth. However, both the aesthetic and the myth have hidden complexities that have been collapsed into an alternative narrative. Through this new myth, the thesis redefines the image of the plum. More broadly, it traces how one specific symbol varies in connotation over time. In our compressed aesthetic, the palm tree truly becomes patronymic, simultaneously revered and abhorred. Through this contronym, we gain insight into how symbols are programmed. Thank you.
Fantastic! Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
That was quite a story. We'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A, and if you all have a question for Ayla, you could go ahead and put in the chat, and she could read it, and she could go ahead and answer it.
Just getting the chat open here.
You don't have to be shy. Nobody gets to see you anyway. It's not like we're back at the studios.
I'll kick things off.
Go for it.
This is really just, I think I've only known you for a few months, and I've just been eager to see your full thesis. So this is really a big treat. I think that just to sort of get the conversation kicked off with the students, it might be interesting for you to maybe unpack for everyone, even just something as intentful as the drawing style. Just because this is probably a very different presentation than what students at this sort of era of their education are used to. You know, I bet students are wondering, where's the floor plan at? Where's the, you know? And I think it's super valuable that your work is showing them another way that architectural rigor and, say, architectural process of investigation could lead to other forms of practice, which I think is what really is highlighted in your work, is just very alternative modes of practice and thinking and how to unpack our environment. So I'm just wondering if maybe you can just speak a little bit about just the way you drew things, the way you tied everything from the drawing to even down to the way you laid out a slide, even down to the way you chose a font. I mean, it all just seems so cohesive. So I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit for everyone.
Definitely, yeah. Yes, I did get a Master's of Architecture without drawing a single floor plan as part of my thesis, which is kind of great. I wanted to be really intentional about the way that I put these drawings together, because I, for a long time, the way that sort of architectural history has been presented to us has been very Eurocentric. So there's an idea that a building is properly proportioned and understood by having specific orthogonal sets of drawings, right? Like you have your plan, your section, your elevation, and this dictates the way that we should see and read buildings. The style that I'm using is a style intentionally used in storytelling. So I was more interested in having a device that was able to communicate to a larger audience that wasn't specific to people in architecture that could just read plans, sections, and elevations, but more so specifically to this set of drawings. There's sort of a combination of things happening here that have the typical views that we might understand of, like, there are some aspects that are in plan, some aspects that are in section, and they're combined in a single drawing in order to push forward a whole series of narratives into one drawing instead of having them as separate pieces. And by collapsing them together, it allows the story to be told within one composition. Other things that I sort of thought about and added little details in the drawing that I never really get a chance to talk about and mention, but I will here, is that the border style for every drawing is actually a pattern that was found at each site. So the pattern was found, photographed, traced, and implemented as a pattern for the border itself. So each element like that sort of comes very intentionally. For example, in this drawing here, can you guys see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay. In this drawing here, you can see, like, you know, the really clear, like, Hollywood Walk of Fame, and then you have like street or you know, cars in elevation. You have a frame in elevation. You have the name of like the stores that are on that specific section of the street that I'm looking at. And the combination of all of these drawings allow us to really pull together that specific narrative that I'm trying to draw in. The other thing I did was use like gold leaf as an accenting device. So here it's digitally portrayed, but there was physical gold leaf on the, let me see if I can full screen this really quick. Here, all of these are actually photographs of the actual prints where these were all gold leafs by hand. On the story itself and on the device that was showing the stories. So the way that it was presented was actually the story was being read, and each of these slides were flipped and shown as a part of this book stand.
This is fantastic. I really love it. I think that it really does show a different perspective on how to approach architecture. As you said, we are taught to read architecture by floor plans, sections, and elevations. How did you get your epiphany, or how did you wake up one day and decide this is the direction I want to take this?
It's a good question. I remember learning in like a high school art class that like historically people didn't really understand perspectives because of the way that they drew things sort of misaligned or had like multiple drawings that were really flat, that were sort of showing like really specific views, and it showed the people really flat and the spaces really flat. And it was always really difficult for me to wrap my mind around like not being able to see perspective, and like why that was something that wasn't like that was taught as being progressed, like, you know, in Europe during like the Renaissance, where it was sort of perfected. And then I took a class about Islamic gardens and actually learned about like the Persian miniature as a device of like kings in India that would, or of the Mughal Empire, that would produce these like exquisite books that would be mythologies of like the stories of the kings, but also just mythologies of what's happening in that region. But there was like one story that really lingered with me, where it was about how these Europeans sent really beautiful, like, you know, real life rendered drawings to these Mughal kings, and the king took those drawings and had his like, you know, the way that these drawings were produced was actually by like many people. So like it was like a layered type of drawing. So he had his like nameh makers actually reproduce those exquisite paintings, and the Europeans couldn't tell the difference between what was produced by the Mughal Empire's like nameh shop and the actual like exquisite drawing that was like the European standard. So it was less about like a lack of knowledge of technique, and it was more about being intentional about a technique of abstraction. So it's almost like moving into emphasizing aspects of a story through a different technique of abstraction that directly links to representation in order to sort of peel apart and show stories that are kind of within the margins and not able to be represented in the way that we typically do it.
Well, thank you. Anyone else? We don't have to be so quiet.
Yeah, you could even unmute yourself and ask the question if you wanted. You don't have to put it in the chat. Did I picture exactly like this in the beginning? Like the process of it? I was definitely not. I think it was very ever evolving, the process of how these drawings came together. And I think it was like a much later decision that it would take. Like for me to only present 8 drawings at an architectural thesis was sort of like really crazy to me. I had to almost convince myself to only be showing those 8 drawings and put all of these different layers into just those 8 drawings. And before I had, you know, many other like really descriptive, very architectural, proportioned, technical drawings of all of these different installations that were placed at each site. And I decided to move away from that and let the representation live in the mythology. There was another question. What did it inspire you or make you choose the topic, especially Los Angeles, California, with their palms being a symbol? And why not another city with their own symbols? That's a really great question, actually. I was initially looking at, I think I was really obsessed with the idea of like nativeness and like what it means to be from somewhere, like in terms of like an identity factor. So the idea of, you know, like what does it look like to be American? What does it look like to be, and as a person that is like from so many different identities that sort of intersect with each other, there's so always sort of like a constant push and pull of like what it means to identify with one thing. And so like the moment that I found out that not a single tree in Los Angeles is native to Los Angeles, I was just like, what does this mean? Like, this is so crazy to me because this is like the thing we all think about immediately. So I was just like, how, like, what's the story of this? Like, why is it so linked to the city? And I just guess I got really obsessed with that question.
I have a question. The stand that you did, with what materials did you have to, like, what was the process for you to choose those materials, and why did you choose those?
That's a great question. Part of it was wanting to have something that I could take big manuscript pages and sort of link different parts of this model together. And part of it was sort of another layer of abstraction where I took each chapter and simplified it further to one element of this book stand. The materials I used were, it was like a really crazy process. So like this center column here that has all of the different decorative fronds are actually an accurate reproduction of like the petticoat from the coat story. And so each of those heights were, so I modeled the extent of the length of the frond and then chopped it for the number of fatal encounters with LAPD, and then that was 3D printed, and then it was molded, and then I poured think it was like resin and then painted the resin. And it's not so clear here, but I also use like really slightly various hues of white on different colors, like white with a little bit of red, white with a little bit of blue, to differentiate different elements. So like this top piece from the center piece, and then these bottom pieces also had, they were actually like an acrylic with mirror paint. So it was actually reflective. You could see the reflection of my shoes right there. Yeah. And then the map itself was etched into the cover of the name.
Anybody else? Geez, I thought we'd get more people to participate since nobody gets to see anybody. All right, well, oh, here you go.
Oh, let me try to find the chat really quick. Sorry. I think I accidentally closed it. Let me see. Do you mind reading the chat out loud? I think
No, that's fine. So the question is, what did you find most interesting about your research?
What did I find most interesting about my research? It's a really great question. I found, I think the whole like history of like the intention of like the railroad companies like hiring people to write like these ideas of like the place for like the perfect white family, like kind of really freaked me out and was kind of interesting. I was like, oh, this was like very, very intentional. Like they didn't want it to seem like the same as the tropics. They wanted it to seem like a civilized tropical land that was for, you know, that removed the idea of like what tropicalness is, which is like away from civilization, away from whiteness. So for that to not just be conceptual, but very concrete and like literature that was being distributed like in the late 1800s was like very startling and interesting to me.
So the next question is, if can I read this thesis or PDF anywhere online?
Yes, if you look up Hamname, there is a PDF online that you can read through, and it has more details and information and images. Yeah, it's also on MIT's DSpace. It's where they archive all of their thesis presentations, or booklets as well, or books.
Could you send me that link later and then I can post it somewhere?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, how long did the whole process take?
It's also a good question. So thesis, the way it's set up at MIT is you have like 6 full months to go into it, but then there's like the semester before, which is like pre-thesis, where you get to start some of the research investigations for it. So about a year, I would say.
The next question says, what is next for you? Are you going to do more investigation about symbols and cities or something new?
There was a point where I wanted to create a series of names for the different cities. So, you know, like the Burke name, the maybe El Paso name, I don't know. And sort of see how different symbols were like different mythologies were attached to different cities and what stories like are completely unknown about them. What I'm working on right now, however, is a little bit different. I'm actually working on a project about the idea of like the feminine labor and what it means to have monetized and unmonetized labor, and representing that. So yeah, that's what I'm planning on diving into next as part of my research. But right now I am teaching at UNM and hopefully want to continue teaching, and yeah.
And then the next question is, how did your professors take to this unique idea, being that it's a very different type of thesis? Has anyone else ever done anything of this nature?
I wouldn't say it was super common, but I would say that the advisors that I chose were very intentional. So my advisor for my thesis was Azra Aksamija, who is part of the Art, Culture, and Technology program at MIT. So her lens of thinking is completely outside of the frame of architecture, but still within our umbrella. And I also had Rania Hossain on my faculty, on my thesis committee, who is really also the type of person that curates, like, a set of really specific images to tell a specific kind of speculative story. So she was, very much behind the idea of like narrowing it down to 8 images that told the whole story, and that's it. So I was lucky to have like a supportive group of faculty to let me run wild with my ideas.
She says thank you. I have one more question, at least on my part. You were at MIT. Was getting the information for LA a task for you, or was it almost like right there? How did that go?
A lot of it was like digging through like newspaper archives and lots of databases, and reading lots of like really old, strange literature about about LA. And I did end up getting like a small funding to go out to LA and conduct a bit more research, which was great. It was part of like a social change workshop that I was doing, so I got funding by being able to do that workshop in LA with high school students. So yeah, that was fun.
Great, thank you. All right, I unless anybody has any more questions, I think we should all unmute ourselves and give Ayla a wonderful round of applause. Yes. Oh, there is one more question. It says, what types of problems did you face when making this?
I think I faced maybe initially, like, there's like an initial anxiety that an idea or a research path that you take won't take you to the story that you hope it takes you to. So that was probably one of the factors that I was always kind of worried about. But as it started to come together, I really, I guess the problems that I faced was making sure like my model components came together, that my drawings were legible, working and pacing myself so I'm not pulling a bunch of all-nighters. Yeah, I see there are a couple other questions here. I was finally able to pull
two more after that. Yeah, two more after that. Okay.
So there's a question: where can I hear about your investigation about feminism in the workplace? Instagram. So it's part of a residency at the Santa Fe Art Institute that I'll be doing next summer. So you can look it up on the Santa Fe Art Institute website, or you could follow my social media account. I don't have anything posted on my own social media account about it just yet, since it's still sort of like in process, but I can type in my handle. And then, has this influenced any projects in your architecture career? It definitely has. And I think it depends on like what dictates an architectural career, if it's the building of buildings, or if it's the way that research is being seen, or the way that representation is being taught. I definitely try to talk to my students about various modes of representation and moving away from, once you establish and learn a convention, how can you break that convention to make a drawing or a set of representations even more powerful? So yeah, that's how it's been sort of working into my career right now.
Thank you. And thank you all for your questions. Ayla, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you for inviting me.
There's a couple of things on the chat, so if you guys check your chats, there's there's a website there that Cesar just put up. So,
oh, that's the link to the Santa Fe Art Institute residency that I have. Cool. Thank you, Cesar.
All right. So again, thank you very much. And I think if you guys can unmute yourself and give her a round of applause, I think definitely.
Thank you.
You.